1942. In the waters off Midway Atoll, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers burned and sank beneath the Pacific. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, the core of the Kido Butai, the strike force that had ranged across the Pacific for 6 months, destroying everything it touched. In Tokyo, the Navy Ministry issued communiques claiming victory. The public heard of American losses, of successful operations, of the Empire's continued advance. But in the offices of the Combined Fleet Headquarters, aboard the battleship Yamato, a different conversation unfolded. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and commander of the Combined Fleet, sat with his Chief of Staff, Admiral Ugaki Matome, reviewing the actual battle reports. 4 fleet carriers lost, over 300 aircraft destroyed, hundreds of Japan's most experienced pilots dead. Against this, the Americans had lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, and approximately 150 aircraft. Ugaki recorded in his diary that night a thought that would prove prophetic. The battle had been a disaster, and the question now was whether Japan could recover faster than its enemy. Yamamoto had always known this question would define the war. He had studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921, had served as a naval attaché in Washington, had traveled across America and seen its factories, its oil fields, its vast industrial capacity. He had opposed war with the United States, had told anyone who would listen that Japan might win victories for 6 months, perhaps a year, but could not win a prolonged conflict against American industrial power. Now, 3 weeks after what the public believed was a great victory, he faced the reality he had predicted. Japan had begun the war with 10 fleet carriers. It now had 6. The United States had begun with 7. It now had 6 as well. Enterprise and Hornet, which had fought at Midway, plus Saratoga undergoing repairs, and Wasp, recently transferred from the Atlantic. Ranger remained in the Atlantic. Lexington had been sunk at the Coral Sea in May. The numbers looked nearly equal. This was the delusion that would haunt Japanese planning for the next 2 years. In July 1942, as Japan consolidated its defensive perimeter and prepared for further operations, intelligence reports began arriving at Combined Fleet Headquarters with information about American shipyard activity. The reports noted increased construction at yards in Newport News, Brooklyn, Philadelphia. They tracked the launching of new hulls, the beginning of what appeared to be a new class of carrier, larger than anything previously built, designated Essex class. The intelligence officers estimated, based on previous American construction rates, that these ships would take 3 to 4 years to complete. Japan, meanwhile, had 2 large carriers under construction: Taiho, incorporating lessons from combat experience, and Shinano, being converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull. Japanese planners calculated these ships would be ready by late 1943 or early 1944. The race seemed manageable. This calculation rested on a fundamental misunderstanding of what was happening in American shipyards. The Essex-class carriers were being built using methods that had never been attempted before. Modular construction, prefabrication of entire sections, round-the-clock shifts on limited resources. The first of the class, USS Essex, had been laid down on April 28, 1941, more than 7 months before Pearl Harbor. By August 1942, it was already 60% complete. Japanese intelligence did not grasp this. How could they? No nation had ever built capital ships at such speed. The assumption that American carriers would take 3 to 4 years to complete was based on how long it took everyone else to build carriers. It was a reasonable assumption. It was catastrophically wrong. August 7, 1942. American forces landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, seizing the partially completed Japanese airfield. The landing surprised Japanese commanders who had not expected the United States to launch offensive operations so soon after Midway. The surprise deepened over the following weeks as the Americans demonstrated not just the willingness to fight for the island, but the capacity to sustain operations there. Throughout August and into September, the naval battles around Guadalcanal revealed something that shocked the combined fleet staff. The Americans had carriers to commit to sustained combat. Enterprise and Saratoga operated in support of the Guadalcanal campaign, engaging Japanese forces repeatedly. When Saratoga was torpedoed by a submarine on August 31st and forced to withdraw for repairs, Wasp and Hornet continued operations. Ugaki wrote in his diary of his growing concern. The Americans were not behaving like a navy that had been crippled at Midway. They were operating aggressively, accepting battle, maintaining a presence that required multiple fleet carriers on station simultaneously. Where were they getting the resources? Where were the reserves that allowed such operations? The answer came in pieces. On September 15th, a Japanese submarine torpedoed and sank USS Wasp. For a moment, it seemed like the tide might turn. The Americans were losing carriers faster than they could replace them. But intelligence reports noted that Saratoga was already returning to service after its August damage, and Enterprise, despite being damaged at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons on August 24th, remained operational. Then came October 26, 1942. The Battle of Santa Cruz. Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku engaged American carriers Hornet and Enterprise in the waters north of the Solomon Islands. The battle resulted in the sinking of Hornet and heavy damage to Enterprise. On paper, it was a Japanese victory. One American fleet carrier sunk, one heavily damaged, versus two Japanese carriers damaged. At Combined Fleet Headquarters, there was cautious optimism. The Americans were down to just Enterprise and Saratoga in the Pacific, both damaged, both requiring repair time. Japan still had Shokaku and Zuikaku, plus several light carriers. For the first time since Midway, Japan had achieved temporary carrier superiority in the Pacific. This optimism lasted approximately 6 weeks. In December 1942, intelligence reports reached Tokyo that sent shockwaves through the Navy Ministry. USS Essex had been commissioned on December 31st, 1942. The ship had gone from keel laying to combat readiness in 20 months. This was impossible. This was faster than any nation had ever built a fleet carrier. Japanese intelligence officers rechecked the reports, certain there had been an error. There was no error. Essex was operational, and intelligence reports indicated it was not alone. More hulls were in advanced stages of construction. The modular building techniques the Americans were using had compressed construction time by nearly half. What Japanese planners had assumed would take 3 to 4 years was taking 18 to 20 months. Yamamoto requested a meeting with Navy Minister Admiral Shimada Shigetaro in early January 1943. The meeting's records are fragmentary, but the outcome was clear: a reassessment of Japan's strategic position. If the Americans could build fleet carriers in under 2 years, and if they had laid down multiple hulls in 1941 and early 1942, then by late 1943, the United States would achieve carrier superiority that Japan could never match. The mathematics were brutal. Japan had begun the war with 10 fleet carriers and had lost 4 at Midway. It had 2 under construction that would not be ready until late 1943 at the earliest. The United States had begun with 7, had lost 4, Lexington, Yorktown, Wasp, Hornet, but had Essex operational and at least 8 more Essex-class hulls in various stages of construction. Japanese shipyards could not match this pace. The reasons were multiple. Fewer shipyards, less steel production, less electrical generating capacity, smaller pools of skilled labor, and most critically, less oil. American shipyards ran 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, powered by unlimited electricity and fueled by unlimited resources. Japanese yards ran slower, constrained by resource shortages that worsened monthly as American submarines began taking a toll on tanker traffic. In February 1943, Yamamoto authorized a series of war games at combined fleet headquarters to model potential outcomes if American carrier production continued at the observed pace. The games assumed Japan would have 6 to 8 fleet carriers available through 1944. They assumed the United States would have 12 to 15 by mid-1944. The results of every war game scenario were the same. Japanese defeat, not close defeat, not honorable defeat, overwhelming, catastrophic defeat. The American numerical advantage would allow them to absorb losses that would be crippling to Japan, to maintain continuous carrier presence across multiple theaters, to launch operations that Japan could not counter simultaneously. The officers running the war games kept rerunning scenarios, changing variables, trying to find a path to victory or even stalemate. They could not find one. The industrial disparity was simply too large. Every scenario that began with American carrier superiority ended with Japanese defeat. Yamamoto read the reports in his cabin aboard Yamato. He had known this was coming. He had warned about this before the war began. He had told Prime Minister Konoe Fumimaro in 1940 that he could run wild for 6 months or a year, but guaranteed nothing after that. It had been 14 months since Pearl Harbor. The 6 months had passed. The year had passed. Now the bill was coming due. On April 18, 1943, Yamamoto was killed when American P-38 fighters intercepted his transport plane over Bougainville. American codebreakers had read Japanese naval communications and planned the ambush specifically to kill him. His death removed the one Japanese naval leader who had fully understood from the beginning what Japan was facing. His successor as commander of the combined fleet was Admiral Koga Minachi. Koga inherited a deteriorating strategic position and intelligence reports that grew more alarming each month. In May 1943, USS Yorktown, the second ship to bear that name, was commissioned, followed by Lexington in February, Bunker Hill in May, Wasp in November, Hornet in November. The Americans were naming new carriers after the ones they had lost, and they were building them faster than Japan could sink them. Japanese intelligence tracked each commissioning, each shakedown cruise, each deployment to the Pacific. The reports landed on desks in Tokyo with increasing frequency. By the end of 1943, the United States had 6 Essex-class carriers operational, plus Enterprise and Saratoga still in service. 8 fleet carriers. Japan had 4, Shokaku, Zuikaku, and 2 smaller fleet carriers. But the numbers understated the disparity. The Essex-class carriers were larger than their Japanese counterparts, carrying 90 to 100 aircraft each compared to 75 to 84 in Japanese carriers. They had better damage control systems, better radar, better anti-aircraft defenses. And most importantly, they had an industrial base behind them that could replace losses in aircraft and pilots far faster than Japan could. The pilot shortage was becoming critical. Japan had begun the war with approximately 3,500 trained carrier pilots. By late 1943, most of the pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor, who had ranged across the Pacific in those first 6 months, were dead. The training programs could not replace them fast enough. Japanese pilot training had been reduced from 3 years to 6 months, then to 3 months. The new pilots arriving at carrier squadrons were barely competent to land on a carrier deck in calm seas, much less engage in combat against American pilots who were receiving increasingly better training and more flight hours. American pilot training programs, by contrast, were expanding. The United States was producing more than 10,000 new pilots per year, training them for 12 to 18 months, giving them hundreds of hours in aircraft before they ever saw combat. The quality gap was widening as fast as the numerical gap. In November 1943, American forces landed in the Gilbert Islands, beginning the drive across the Central Pacific. The carriers supporting the operation included Essex, Yorktown, Lexington, Enterprise, and Saratoga. 5 fleet carriers, operating together, launching strikes that overwhelmed Japanese defenses through sheer weight of numbers. At Combined Fleet Headquarters, now relocated to Truk, Koga reviewed intelligence estimates of American carrier strength. The estimates projected that by mid-1944, the United States would have 12 to 15 fleet carriers operational in the Pacific. Japan would have 6 at most. Koga convened his staff to discuss options. The discussion was bleak. Japan could not win a carrier battle against such odds. The only hope was to avoid decisive engagement until Japan could rebuild its air groups, train new pilots, and somehow narrow the gap. But avoiding engagement meant ceding the initiative to the Americans, allowing them to advance across the Pacific at their chosen pace. The alternative was to seek a decisive battle on favorable terms, using land-based air power to supplement carrier air power, hoping to achieve local superiority through concentration of forces. This was the strategy that would lead to the Battle of the Philippine Sea. By March 1944, intelligence reports indicated the Americans now had 9 Essex-class carriers operational, plus Enterprise and Saratoga. 11 fleet carriers, and more were coming. The reports noted that additional Essex-class hulls were in advanced stages of construction, with commissioning dates scheduled through 1944 and into 1945. Japanese naval planners sat in their offices in Tokyo reading these reports and confronted a reality that was almost incomprehensible. The Americans were building fleet carriers faster than Japan could build destroyers. The industrial disparity was not just large, it was absolute. There was no path to parity, no hope of matching production, no possibility of winning an industrial race. Koga was killed on March 31, 1944, when his aircraft disappeared in a storm while flying from Palau to Mindanao. His replacement, Admiral Toyoda Soemu, inherited the command, just as the reality Japanese leadership had been trying to avoid became unavoidable. June 19, 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japanese carriers Taiho, Shokaku, Zuikaku, and 6 light carriers faced an American force of 15 carriers, 7 Essex-class, 2 Independence-class light carriers converted from cruiser hulls, Enterprise, and 5 more Essex-class that had been commissioned in the first half of 1944. 15 carriers. The Americans had 15 fleet and light carriers concentrated in a single task force. Japan had 9, and 3 of those were light carriers with limited aircraft capacity. The battle lasted 2 days. American fighters, equipped with radar and directed by fighter control officers aboard the carriers, intercepted Japanese strikes before they reached the American fleet. Of approximately 375 Japanese aircraft launched, approximately 300 were shot down. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese carriers Taiho and Shokaku were sunk by submarine attacks. Zuikaku survived but lost most of its air group. In Tokyo, when the reports arrived, there was silence in the Navy Ministry offices. The numbers were undeniable now. The Americans had not just recovered from Midway, they had built a fleet that dwarfed anything Japan could field. The 4 carriers lost at Midway had been replaced by more than a dozen new ones, each more capable than the ones they replaced. A staff officer at the Navy Ministry, reviewing the battle reports, made a notation in the margin of one document. We calculated they would need 3 years to build these ships. They did it in 18 months. We did not understand what we were facing. This was the moment of full realization, though it had come far too late. The industrial capacity that Yamamoto had warned about, that he had seen firsthand during his time in America, had manifested exactly as he had predicted. The United States had not just recovered from Midway, it had buried Japan under an avalanche of production that no amount of courage or skill could overcome.